Plot summary of Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Lady Dedlock is very bored in her stylish London townhouse. She is married to the nobleman Sir Leicester Dedlock. People say she is cold and proud, but there is a rumor that she is not from a noble family and Sir Leicester married her anyway. Mr. Tulkinghorn, the lawyer for her husband, comes and reads some legal papers to them. Lady Dedlock gets pale and asks who wrote the paper when it gets to the middle. Mr. Tulkinghorn, who is quiet and tough, says that the document was written by an anonymous law writer. Mr. Tulkinghorn keeps reading, and Lady Dedlock goes to her room because she feels dizzy. Esther Summerson is an orphan who has been raised by her godmother, Miss Barbary. Miss Barbary is a strict, religious woman who seems to dislike Esther and keeps her away from other kids. Esther wants to be loved and accepted, so on her birthday one year, she asks her godmother to tell her about her past. Miss Barbary tells Esther in a mean way that she was her mother's shame. Esther is upset, and she doesn't know what her Miss Barbary is getting at. 2 years later, Esther is reading the Bible to Miss Barbary when she has a stroke. She dies soon after. At the funeral for Esther's godmother, a man she has seen at Miss Barbary's house talks to her. This man's name is Mr. Kenge, and he tells Esther that Miss Barbary was really her aunt and that her new guardian, Mr. Jarndyce, will take care of her at school. Esther is shocked and very thankful. She loves school and is learning how to become a governess. After 6 years of school, Esther is told that she needs to go to London and become the friend of a young woman who is a ward of the court in a case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce. When Esther gets to London, a clerk named Mr. Guppy tells her to go to the Court of Chancery. Here, she meets her new friend Ada Clare and Richard Carstone, who is a ward of the court and Ada's cousin. The Court of Chancery is a big, old institution that specifically handles property disputes. Many of the cases, like Jarndyce and Jarndyce, have been going on for a long time and have broken up families. Esther is glad she wasn't born into this situation like Richard and Ada. The three of them are waiting to be taken to Mrs. Jellyby's house, where they will spend the night. They meet a crazy old woman named Miss Flight outside the courthouse. She is very excited to meet the wards in Jarndyce. Mrs. Jellyby's house is very messy and full of children who haven't been cared for. Mrs. Jellyby is a charitable person who only cares about her work in Africa. Esther makes friends with Mrs. Jellyby's oldest daughter, Caddy. The next morning, Esther, Richard, Caddy, and Ada go for a walk. When they get close to the court, they meet Miss Flight, who invites them to her home so they can see where she lives. Miss Flight lives above a shop run by a man named Crook. Crook's shop is full of old law papers that he can't read because he can't read or write. Miss Flight's room is small, and she keeps birds in cages in her window. She says she will set the birds free when her chancery case is over. Nemo, a man who writes about law, also lives in the house. The next day, Richard, Esther, and Ada are taken to Bleak House by their guardian, who welcomes them with open arms. Esther is put in charge of cleaning the house, and she grows to love her new friends. Mr. Tulkinghorn, meanwhile, goes to Crook's shop and asks for Nemo, the writer. Crook tells him how to get to Nemo's room, but when Mr. Tulkinghorn gets there, he finds that the writer has died from taking too much opium. Mr. Tulkinghorn sends a few people into the room to look for important legal papers. Mr. Tulkinghorn finds out that a poor boy named Joe who sweeps the streets nearby knew the writer a little, so Joe is sent to the inquest. Not long after that, Joe is out one night when a mysterious woman in all black with a veil comes up to him and gives him money to show her where Nemo is buried. Joe does what the woman says, but she is afraid of her. A while later, Mr. Tulkinghorn calls Joe to his office, where he is with a police officer named Mr. Bucket, and asks him to name another woman in a black dress who is wearing a veil. Joe is confused, but she says this can't be the same woman because she doesn't wear rings. Mr. Jarndyce tries to help Richard decide what he wants to do for a living, but Richard can't decide and sometimes dreams that he'll be rich when the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce is over. Esther sees that Ada and Richard are in love, and one day they tell her that they're getting married. Mr. Jarndyce has a lot of friends who like to help people in need. One afternoon, Esther and Ada go with one of these friends to the house of a brickmaker. There, they meet Jenny and Liz, two poor women who they become friends with. Mr. Jarndyce takes Esther and Ada on vacation to stay with his friend Mr. Boythorn, who lives next door to Chesney Wold, Sir Leicester's country house. One afternoon, Esther sees Lady Dedlock and her French servant Mademoiselle Hortense in church. She has the strange feeling that Lady Dedlock doesn't like her but also thinks she looks a bit like herself. When Esther comes back, she hears that Jenny and Liz have taken in Joe, who is very sick, but that they can't keep him at their house because their husbands are violent. Esther agrees to take Joe in and care for him, but during the night, Joe goes missing. Esther gets sick, and the disease leaves her face so scarred that it's hard to tell who she is. Esther isn't too upset about losing her beauty, but she is sad because she has fallen in love with a young doctor, Mr. Woodcourt, who is at sea right now. She thinks he won't love her now that she doesn't look as good, so she talks herself out of the romance. While Esther is sick, her servant tells her that a woman in a veil has been to Jenny's house several times to ask about Esther's health. She can't figure out who this woman could be. Soon after this, Esther goes to Mr. Boythorn's house in the country to get better. One day, Lady Dedlock finds her walking in the woods near Chesney Wold. Lady Dedlock says she is Esther's real mother and that she didn't know Esther was still alive. She was told that Esther died at birth, but her sister, Miss Barbary, took Esther and raised her in secret. Captain Hawdon, who is also Nemo, is Esther's father. Lady Dedlock says that no one knows her secret, but she is very afraid that Mr. Tulkinghorn will find out and tell everyone. So, she will never be able to see Esther again. Esther is upset, but she lets her mother off the hook. Esther goes back to Bleak House and tells Mr. Jarndyce something personal. He is very nice to her and tells her that he loves her. He asks her to marry him, and after a short thought, she says yes. In the meantime, Richard's career is going downhill. He has changed jobs 3 times and can't seem to find one he likes. Esther is worried when she finds out that he has hired a lawyer, a man named Mr. Voles, and that he has quit his job to focus on solving the case. He has also turned against Mr. Jarndyce, who has tried to stop him from working with Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Mr. Jarndyce has seen people go crazy because of chancery lawsuits, and he is worried that Richard is going crazy too. Ada is very worried, but she stays true to Richard. She tells Ada one day that she and Richard have secretly gotten married and that she will no longer live with Mr. Jarndyce but with Richard. She doesn't have anything bad to say about her guardian and hopes that Richard will soon change his mind. Esther is very upset, but she agrees with what Ada wants. She asks Mr. Woodcourt, who has just returned from the sea, to check on Richard from time to time and make sure he is doing well. A few weeks later, Mr. Tulkinghorn tells Lady Dedlock that he knows her secret. Lady Dedlock gets angry and confronts him, telling him the truth. Mr. Tulkinghorn says with pride that he has proof that she was Captain Hawdon's lover when she was young. He knows that she recognized his handwriting because he has a sample of it to compare with some of her letters that have been found. Lady Dedlock knows that Mr. Tulkinghorn will tell her secret, but she doesn't know what to do. She can't bear to hurt her husband, who has always been nice to her. When Mr. Tulkinghorn gets home, his living room is where he is shot. Sir Leicester offers a reward for the person who killed Mr. Tulkinghorn, and Mr. Bucket offers to help find the killer. He gets a letter that says Lady Dedlock killed the man, and when he goes to her house, he finds that she has left. Mademoiselle Hortense kills the lawyer to try to frame Lady Dedlock, so Mr. Bucket goes and gets her. Mr. Bucket knows that Lady Dedlock's secret has been told, and he tells Sir Leicester about it. Sir Leicester has a stroke because he is so shocked, but he recovers. He tells Mr. Bucket that he is sorry for Lady Dedlock and begs him to find her. It's winter, and she's outside by herself in the snow. Esther goes with Mr. Bucket to look for her mother. They find out that Lady Dedlock went to Jenny's house, which is close to Bleak House, to look for Esther. She stole Jenny's clothes and went back to London as someone else. They find her dead body next to the grave of Captain Hawdon. She had died from the cold. Richard dies of tuberculosis not long after this. Esther hears from Ada that she is pregnant, which gives her hope for the future. Esther is still engaged to Mr. Jarndyce, but when Mr. Woodcourt tells her he loves her, Mr. Jarndyce is kind enough to let them get married. He gives them a house in Yorkshire, where Mr. Woodcourt works at a hospital for the poor. They have a happy, simple life together, and Esther will always be thankful for all the love she has gotten.
About the author. Charles Dickens was born in the English town of Portsmouth in 1812. His family moved to London, where they lived in different parts of the city when he was young. Dickens's education ended when his father went to prison for not paying his bills. Dickens was 12 years old at the time, and while the rest of his family went with his father to jail, Dickens was sent to work in a blacking warehouse. He never forgot what it was like to work as a child, and it became a major theme in many of his books. Dickens began working as a journalist when he was 20 years old. He was a very ambitious young man, and it didn't take long for his political cartoons to become popular after they were published in London magazines. After this first success, his first book, The Pickwick Papers, came out in installments. Dickens decided to release his books in small parts over a long time, so that poor readers could buy cheap magazines instead of a pricey book. This method was very popular with Victorian readers. Dickens was well known in both Britain and the United States. In 1842, he went to the United States with his wife, Caroline Hogarth. After he moved back to England, Dickens became the editor of a newspaper in London. He also bought a house in Kent and wrote several more successful books there. He was a well-known public figure and very well known in the literary and social scene of London. Dickens and Catherine had 10 children together, but in 1857, Dickens left Catherine for 18-year-old Ellen Ternan. Dickens stayed with Ellen until the end of his life. In his later years, Dickens set up a number of very successful reading tours around the world, including one in the United States. In 1870, he died from a series of strokes. He was buried in Rochester Cathedral.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.